Chapter 15 of Sylvia's Lovers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kath Gard. Sylvia's Lovers by Elizabeth Gaskell. Chapter 15. A Difficult Question. Philip went to bed with that kind of humble penitent gratitude in his heart, which we sometimes feel after a sudden revulsion of feeling from despondency to hope. The night before, it seemed as if all events were so arranged as to thwart him in his dearest wishes. He felt now as if his discontent and repining, not 24 hours before, had been almost impious, so great was the change in his circumstances for the better. Now all seemed promising for the fulfilment of what he most desired. He was almost convinced that he was mistaken in thinking that Kinraid had had anything more than a sailor's admiration for a pretty girl with regard to Sylvia. At any rate, he was going away to-morrow, in all probability not to return for another year, for Greenland ships left for the northern seas as soon as there was a chance of the ice being broken up. And ere then he himself might speak out openly, laying before her parents all his fortunate prospects, and before her all his deep passionate love. So this night his prayers were more than the mere form that they had been the night before. They were a vehement expression of gratitude to God for having, as it were, interfered on his behalf, to grant him the desire of his eyes and the lust of his heart. He was like too many of us. He did not place his future life in the hands of God, and only ask for grace to do his will in whatever circumstances might arise, but he yearned in that terrible way after a blessing which, when granted under such circumstances, too often turns out to be equivalent to a curse. And that spirit brings with it the material and earthly idea that all events that favour our wishes are answers to our prayer, and so they are in one sense, but they need prayer in a deeper and higher spirit to keep us from the temptation to evil which such events invariably bring with them. Philip little knew how Sylvia's time had been passed that day. If he had, he would have laid down this night with even a heavier heart than he had done on the last. Charlie Kinraid accompanied his cousins as far as the spot where the path to Haytersbank Farm diverged. Then he stopped his merry talk and announced his intention of going to see Farmer Robson. Bessie Corney looked disappointed and a little sulky, but her sister Molly Brunton laughed and said, "Tell truth, lad, Dan'l Robson niver have a call for thee if he hadn't a pretty daughter." "Indeed, but he would," replied Charlie, rather annoyed. "When I've said a thing, I do it. I promised last night to go see him. Besides, I like the old man." "Well, when shall we tell mother you're coming home?" "Toward 8 o'clock, mebbe sooner." "Why, it's bare 5 now. Bless lad, does he think o' staying there a neet, and they up so late last night, and Mrs. Robson ailing beside? Mother'll not think it kind on you either, will she, Bess?" "I dunno. Charlie mun do as he likes. I dare say no one'll miss him if he does bide away till 8. "Well, well, I can't tell what I shall do, but you'd best not stop lingering here, for it's getting on, and there'll be a keen frost by t' look o' th' stars." Haytersbank was closed for the night, as far as it ever was closed. There were no shutters to the windows, nor did they care to draw the inside curtains, so few were the passers by. The house door was fastened, but the shippen door a little on in the same long low block of building stood open, and a dim light made an oblong upon the snowy ground outside. As Kinraid drew near he heard talking there, and a woman's voice. He threw a passing glance through the window into the fire-lit house-place, and seeing Mrs. Robson asleep by the fireside in her easy-chair, he went on. There was the intermittent sound of the sharp whistling of milk into the pail, and Kester, sitting on a 3-legged stool, cajoling a capricious cow into letting her fragrant burden flow. Sylvia stood near the farther window ledge, on which a horn lantern was placed, pretending to knit at a grey worsted stocking, but in reality laughing at Kester's futile endeavours, and finding quite enough to do with her eyes in keeping herself untouched by the whisking tail or the occasional kick. The frosty air was mellowed by the warm and odorous breath of the cattle, breath that hung about the place in faint misty clouds. There was only a dim light, such as it was. It was not dearly defined against the dark heavy shadow in which the old black rafters and manger and partitions were enveloped. As Charlie came to the door, Kester was saying, "Quiet with 'ee, wench. Theere now, she's a beauty if she'll stand still. There's niver sich a cow i' t' riding, if she'll only behave hersel. She's a bonny lass, she is. Let down her milk, there's a pretty." "Why, Kester," laughed Sylvia, "thou'rt asking her for her milk wi' as many pretty speeches as thou wert wooing a wife." "Eh, lass," said Kester, turning a bit towards her, and shutting one eye to cock the other the better upon her, an operation which puckered up his already wrinkled face into 1,000 new lines and folds. "And how does thee know how a man woos a wife, that thee talks so knowing about it? That's telling. Some un's been trying it on thee." "There's never a one been so impudent," said Sylvia, reddening and tossing her head a little. "I'd like to see 'em try me." "Will, will," said Kester, wilfully misunderstanding her meaning. "Thou mun be patient, wench, and if thou's a good lass, maybe thy turn'll come, and they'll try it." "I wish thou'd talk o' what thou've some knowledge on, Kester, i'stead o' i' that silly way," replied Sylvia. "Then I mun talk no more about women, for they're past knowing, and drove e'en King Solomon silly." At this moment Charlie stepped in. Sylvia gave a little start, and dropped her ball of worsted. Kester made as though absorbed in his task of cajoling Black Nell, but his eyes and ears were both vigilant. "I was going into the house, but I saw your mother asleep, and I didn't want to waken her, so I just came on here. Is your father to the fore?" "No," said Sylvia, hanging down her head a little, wondering if he could have heard the way in which she and Kester had been talking, and thinking over her little foolish jokes with anger against herself. "Father is gone to Winthrop about some pigs as he's heard on. He'll not be back till 7 o'clock or so." It was but 5:30, and Sylvia, in the irritation of the moment, believed that she wished Kinraid would go. But she would have been extremely disappointed if he had. Kinraid himself seemed to have no thought of the kind. He saw with his quick eyes, not unaccustomed to women, that his coming so unexpectedly had fluttered Sylvia, and anxious to make her quite at her ease with him, and not unwilling to conciliate Kester, he addressed his next speech to him with the same kind of air of interest in the old man's pursuit that a young man of a different class sometimes puts on when talking to the chaperone of a pretty girl in a ball-room. "That's a handsome beast yo've just been milking, master." "Ay, but handsome is as handsome does. It were only yesterday as she aimed her leg right at t' pail wi' t' afterings in. She knowed it were afterings as well as any Christian, and t' more t' mischief, t' better she likes it. And if I hadn't been too quick for her, it would ha' gone swash down in t' litter. This un's a far better cow in t' long run. She's just a steady goer." As the milky downpour came musical and even from the stall next to Black Nell's, Sylvia was knitting away vigorously, thinking all the while that it was a great pity she had not put on a better gown, or even a cap with brighter ribbon, and quite unconscious how very pretty she looked standing against the faint light, her head a little bent down, her hair catching bright golden touches as it fell from under her little linen cap, her pink bedgown confined by her apron string giving a sort of easy grace to her figure, her dark full linsey petticoat short above her trim ankles, looking far more suitable to the place where she was standing than her long gown of the night before would have done. Kinraid was wanting to talk to her, and to make her talk, but was uncertain how to begin. In the meantime, Kester went on with the subject last spoken about. "Black Nell's at her fourth cow now, so she ought to have left off her tricks and turned sober like. But bless yo', there's some cows as'll be skittish till they're fat for t' butcher. Not but what I like milking her better nor a steady goer, a man has always summat to be watching for, and I'm kinder set up when I mastered her at last. T' young missus there, she's mighty fond o' coming to see Black Nell at her tantrums. She'd niver come near me if her cow was like this'n." "Do you often come and see the cows milked?" asked Kinraid. "Many a time," said Sylvia, smiling a little. "Why, when we're throng, I help Kester, but now we've only Black Nell and Daisy giving milk. Kester knows as I can milk Black Nell quite easy," she continued, half vexed that Kester had not named this accomplishment. "Ay, when she's in a good frame o' mind, as she is sometimes, but t' difficulty is to milk her at all times. I wish I'd come a bit sooner. I should like to seen you milk Black Nell," addressing Sylvia. "Yo'd better come to morrow e'en, and see what a hand shall mak' on her," said Kester. "To morrow night I shall be far on my road back to Shields." "To morrow!" said Sylvia, suddenly looking up at him, and then dropping her eyes as she found he had been watching for the effect of his intelligence on her. "I mun be back at t' Whaler, where I'm engaged," continued he. "She's fitting up after a fresh fashion, and as I've been one as wanted new ways, I mun be on the spot for t' look after her. Maybe I shall take a run down here afore sailing in March. I'm sure I shall try." There was a good deal meant and understood by these last few words. The tone in which they were spoken gave them a tender intensity not lost upon either of the hearers. Kester cocked his eye once more, but with as little obtrusiveness as he could, and pondered the sailor's looks and ways. He remembered his coming about the place the winter before, and how the old master had then appeared to have taken to him, but at that time Sylvia had seemed to Kester too little removed from a child to have either art or part in Kinraid's visits. Now, however, the case was different. Kester in his sphere, among his circle of acquaintance, narrow though it was, had heard with much pride of Sylvia's bearing away the bell at church and at market wherever girls of her age were congregated. He was a north countryman, so he gave out no further sign of his feelings than his mistress and Sylvia's mother had done on a like occasion. "T' lass is weel enough," said he, but he grinned to himself and looked about, and listened to the hearsay of every lad, wondering who was handsome and brave and good enough to be Sylvia's mate. Now of late it had seemed to the canny farm servant pretty clear that Philip Hepburn was "after her", and to Philip Kester had an instinctive objection, a kind of natural antipathy, such as has existed in all ages between the dwellers in a town and those in the country, between agriculture and trade. So while Kinraid and Sylvia kept up their half tender, half jesting conversation, Kester was making up his slow persistent mind as to the desirability of the young man then present as a husband for his darling, as much from his being other than Philip in every respect as from the individual good qualities he possessed. Kester's first opportunity of favouring Kinraid's suit consisted in being as long as possible over his milking. So never were cows that required such stripping or were expected to yield such afterings as Black Nell and Daisy that night. But all things must come to an end, and at length Kester got up from his three-legged stool, on seeing what the others did not, that the dip candle in the lantern was coming to an end, and that in 2 or 3 minutes more the shippen would be in darkness, and so his pails of milk be endangered. In an instant Sylvia had started out of her delicious dreamland, her drooping eyes were raised, and recovered their power of observation, her ruddy arms were freed from the apron in which she had enfolded them as a protection from the gathering cold, and she had seized and adjusted the wooden yoke across her shoulders, ready to bear the brimming milk pails to the dairy. "Look yo' at her!" exclaimed Kester to Charlie, as he adjusted the fragrant pails on the yoke. She thinks she's missus already, and she's allays for carrying in milk since t' rheumatiz crotched my shoulder i' t' back end; and when she says yea, it's as much as my heed's worth to say nay.' And along the wall, round the corner, down the round slippery stones of the rambling farmyard, behind the buildings, did Sylvia trip, safe and well poised, though the ground wore all one coating of white snow, and in many places was so slippery as to oblige Kinraid to linger near Kester, the lantern bearer. Kester did not lose his opportunity, though the cold misty night air provoked his asthmatic cough whenever he breathed, and often interrupted his words. 'She's a good wench as iver was, and come on a good stock, and that's summat, whether in a cow or a woman. I've known her from a baby. She's a reet down good un.' By this time they had reached the back kitchen door, just as Sylvia had unladen herself, and were striking a light with flint and tinder. The house seemed warm and inviting after the piercing outer air, although the kitchen into which they entered contained only a raked and slumbering fire at one end, over which, on a crook, hung the immense pan of potatoes cooking for the evening meal of the pigs. To this pan Kester immediately addressed himself, swinging it round with ease, owing to the admirable simplicity of the old-fashioned machinery. Kinraid stood between Kester and the door into the dairy, through which Sylvia had vanished with the milk. He half wished to conciliate Kester by helping him, but he seemed also attracted by a force which annihilated his will to follow her wherever she went. Kester read his mind. 'Let alone,' said he. 'Pig's vittle takes noan such dainty carrying as milk. I may set it down and niver spill a drop. She's noan fit for t' serve swine, nor yo other, mester. Better help her teem t' milk.' So Kinraid followed the light, his light, into the icy chill of the dairy, where the bright polished tin cans were quickly dimmed with the warm sweet smelling milk that Sylvia was emptying out into the brown pans. In his haste to help her, Charlie took up one of the pails. 'That'n's to be strained. You have the cow's hair in. Mother's very particular, and cannot abide a hair.' So she went over to her awkward dairymaid, and before she, but not before he, was aware of the sweet proximity, she was adjusting his happy awkward arms to the new office of holding a milk strainer over the bowl and pouring the white liquid through it. 'There,' she said, looking up for a moment and half blushing. 'Now you'll know how to do it next time.' 'I wish next time was to come now,' said Kinraid, but she had returned to her own pail, and seemed not to hear him. He followed her to her side of the dairy. 'I've but a short memory. Can yo not show me again how to hold t' strainer?' 'No,' she said, half laughing, but holding her strainer fast in spite of his insinuating efforts to unlock her fingers. 'But there's no need to tell me yo gotten a short memory. Why, what have I done? How done you know it?' 'Last night,' she began, and then she stopped and turned away her head, pretending to be busy in her dairy duties of rinsing and such like. 'Well,' said he, half conjecturing her meaning, and flattered by it, if his conjecture were right. 'Last night, what?' 'Oh, you know,' said she, as if impatient at being both literally and metaphorically followed about and driven into a corner. 'No, tell me,' persisted he. 'Well,' said she, 'if yo will have it. I think yo showed yo but a short memory when yo didn't know me again. And yo were 5 times at this house last winter, and that's not so long sin'. But I suppose yo see a vast o' things on your voyages by land or by sea, and then it's but natural yo should forget.' She wished she could go on talking, but could not think of anything more to say just then, for in the middle of her sentence the flattering interpretation he might put upon her words, on her knowing so exactly the number of times he had been to Haytersbank, flashed upon her, and she wanted to lead the conversation a little farther afield, to make it a little less personal. This was not his wish, however. In a tone which thrilled through her, even in her own despite, he said, Do yo' think that can ever happen again, Sylvia?" She was quite silent, almost trembling. He repeated the question as if to force her to answer. Driven to bay, she equivocated. "What happen again? Let me go, I dunno what yo're talking about, and I'm a'most numbed wi' cold." For the frosty air came sharp in through the open lattice window, and the ice was already forming on the milk. Kinraid would have found a ready way of keeping his cousins, or indeed most young women, warm, but he paused before he dared put his arm round Sylvia. She had something so shy and wild in her look and manner, and her very innocence of what her words, spoken by another girl, might lead to, inspired him with respect, and kept him in check. So he contented himself with saying, "I'll let yo' go into t' warm kitchen, if yo'll tell me if yo' think I can ever forget yo' again." She looked up at him defiantly, and set her red lips firm. He enjoyed her determination not to reply to this question; it showed she felt its significance. Her pure eyes looked steadily into his, nor was the expression in his such as to daunt her or make her afraid. They were like two children defying each other, each determined to conquer. At last she unclosed her lips, and nodding her head as if in triumph, said, as she folded her arms once more in her check apron, "Yo'll have to go home sometime." "Not for a couple of hours yet," said he, "and yo'll be frozen first, so yo'd better say if I can ever forget yo' again, wi'out more ado." Perhaps the fresh voices breaking on the silence, perhaps the tones were less modulated than they had been before, but anyhow Bell Robson's voice was heard calling Sylvia through the second door, which opened from the dairy to the house place, in which her mother had been till this moment asleep. Sylvia darted off in obedience to the call, glad to leave him, as at that moment Kinraid resentfully imagined. Through the open door he heard the conversation between mother and daughter, almost unconscious of its meaning, so difficult did he find it to wrench his thoughts from the ideas he had just been forming with Sylvia's bright, lovely face right under his eyes. "Sylvia," said her mother, "who's yonder?" Bell was sitting up in the attitude of one startled out of slumber into intensity of listening, her hands on each of the chair arms, as if just going to rise. "There's a fremd man i' th' house. I heard his voice." It's just Charlie Kinraid. He was a talking to me at dairy." "I' dairy, lass? And how come he i' dairy?" "He come to see feyther." "Feyther asked him last night," said Sylvia, conscious that he could overhear every word that was said, and a little suspecting that he was no great favourite with her mother. "Thy feyther's out. How comed he i' dairy?" persevered Bell. "He come past this window, and saw yo' asleep, and didn't like for t' waken yo', so he come out on t' shippen, and when I carried t' milk in." But now Kinraid came in, feeling the awkwardness of the situation a little, yet with an expression so pleasant and manly in his open face, and in his exculpatory manner, that Sylvia lost his first words in a strange kind of pride of possession in him, about which she did not reason nor care to define the grounds. But her mother rose from her chair somewhat formally, as if she did not intend to sit down again while he stayed, yet was too weak to be kept in that standing attitude long. "I'm afeared, sir, Sylvie hasn't told yo' that my master's out, and not like to be in till late. He'll be main and sorry to have missed yo'." There was nothing for it after this but to go. His only comfort was that on Sylvia's rosy face he could read unmistakable signs of regret and dismay. His sailor's life, in bringing him suddenly face to face with unexpected events, had given him something of that self-possession which we consider the attribute of a gentleman, and with an apparent calmness which almost disappointed Sylvia, who construed it into a symptom of indifference as to whether he went or stayed. He bade her mother good night, and only said, in holding her hand a minute longer than was absolutely necessary, "I'm coming back ere I sail, and then mebbe you'll answer yon question." He spoke low, and her mother was rearranging herself in her chair, else Sylvia would have had to repeat the previous words. As it was, with soft, thrilling ideas ringing through her, she could get her wheel and sit down to her spinning by the fire. Waiting for her mother to speak first, Sylvia dreamt her dreams. Bell Robson was partly aware of the state of things as far as it lay on the surface. She was not aware how deep down certain feelings had penetrated into the girl's heart who sat on the other side of the fire, with a little sad air diffused over her face and figure. Bell looked upon Sylvia as still a child, to be warned off forbidden things by threats of danger. But the forbidden thing was already tasted, and possible danger in its full acquisition only served to make it more precious sweet. Bell sat upright in her chair, gazing into the fire. Her milk-white linen mob cap fringed around and softened her face, from which the usual apple red was banished by illness, and the features, from the same cause, rendered more prominent and stern. She had a clean buff kerchief round her neck, and stuffed into the bosom of her Sunday woollen gown of dark blue. If she had been in working trim she would have worn a bedgown like Sylvia's. Her sleeves were pinned back at the elbows, and her brown arms and hard-working hands lay crossed in unwonted idleness on her check apron. Her knitting was by her side, and if she had been going through any accustomed calculation or consideration, she would have had it busily clicking in her fingers. But she had something quite beyond common to think about, and perhaps to speak about, and for the minute she was not equal to knitting. 'Sylvie,' she began at length, 'did I e'er tell thee on Nancy Hartley as I knew when I were a child? I'm thinking a deal on her to night. Maybe it's because I've been dreaming on yon old times. She was a bonny lass as ever were seen, I've heard folk say, but that were afore I knew her. When I knew her she was crazy, poor wench, wi' her black hair a streaming down her back, and her eyes as were almost as black, allus crying out for pity, though never a word she spoke but "He once was here." Just that, o'er and o'er again. Whether she were cold or hot, full or hungry, "He once was here," were all her speech. She had been farm servant to my mother's brother, James Hepburn, thy great uncle as was. She were a poor friendless wench, a parish prentice, but honest and gowm-like, till a lad, as nobody knowed, come o'er the hills one sheep shearing fra Whitehaven. He had summat to do with the sea, though not rightly to be called a sailor, and he made a deal on Nancy Hartley just to beguile the time like. And he went away, and ne'er sent a thought after her more. It's the way as lads have, and there's no holding 'em when there's fellers as nobody knows, neither where they come fro nor what they've been doing a' their lives, till they come athwart some poor wench like Nancy Hartley. She were but a softy after all, for she left off doing her work in a proper manner. I've heerd my aunt say as she found out as summat was wrong wi' Nancy as soon as th' milk turned bingy, for there ne'er had been such a clean lass about her milk cans afore that. And from bad it grew to worse, and she would sit and do nothing but play wi' her fingers from morn till night. And if they asked her what ailed her, she just said, "He once was here." And if they bid her go about her work, it were a' the same. And when they scolded her, and pretty sharp too, she would stand up and put her hair from her eyes, and look about her like a crazy thing, searching for her wits, and ne'er finding them, for all she could think on was just, "He once was here." It were a caution to me again, thinking a man to mean what he says when he's a talking to a young woman. "But what became on poor Nancy?" asked Sylvia. "What should become on her, or on any lass that gives herself up to thinking on a man who cares nowt for her?" replied her mother a little severely. "She were crazed, and my aunt couldn't keep her on, could she? She did keep her a long weary time, thinking as she would maybe come to herself, and anyhow she were a motherless wench. But at length she had for to go where she came fro, back to Keswick workhouse, and when last I heard on her, she were chained to th' great kitchen dresser i' th' workhouse. They'd beaten her till she were taught to be silent and quiet i' th' daytime, but at night, when she were left alone, she would take up th' oud cry till it wrung their heart, so they'd many a time to come down and beat her again to get any peace. It were a caution to me, as I said afore, to keep fro' thinking on men as thought nowt on me.' 'Poor crazy Nancy!' sighed Sylvia. The mother wondered if she had taken the caution to herself, or was only full of pity for the mad girl, dead long before. End of chapter 15.
Of Sylvia's Lovers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lauren McCullough. Sylvia's Lovers by Elizabeth Gaskell. Chapter 16. As the day lengthens, so the cold strengthens. It was so that year. The hard frost which began on New Year's Eve lasted on and on until late February, black and bitter, but welcome enough to the farmers, as it kept back the too early growth of the autumn-sown wheat and gave them the opportunity of leading manure. But it did not suit the invalids as well, and Belle Robson, though not getting worse, did not make any progress towards amendment. Sylvia was kept busy notwithstanding that she had the assistance of a poor widow woman in the neighbourhood on cleaning, or washing, or churning days. Her life was quiet and monotonous, although hard-working, and while her hands mechanically found and did their accustomed labour, the thoughts that rose in her head always centred on Charlie Kinraid. His ways, his words, his looks, whether they all meant what she would fain believe they did, and whether meaning love at the time such a feeling was likely to endure. Her mother's story of crazy Nancy had taken hold of her, but not as a caution, rather as a parallel case to her own. Like Nancy, and borrowing the poor girl's own words, she would say softly to herself, "He once was here." But all along, she believed in her heart he would come back again to her, though it touched her strangely to imagine the agonies of forsaken love. Philip knew little of this. He was very busy with facts and figures, doggedly fighting through the necessary business, and only now and then allowing himself the delicious relaxation of going to Haytersbank in an evening to inquire about his aunt's health, and to see Sylvia, for the two Fosters were punctiously anxious to make their shopmen test all their statements, insisting on an examination of the stock, as if Hepburn and Coulson were strangers to the shop, having the Monkshaven auctioneer in to appraise the fixtures and necessary furniture, going over the shop books for the last 20 years with their successors, an employment which took up evening after evening, and not unfrequently taking one of the young men on the long commercial journeys which tediously made in a gig. By degrees, both Hepburn and Coulson were introduced to distinct manufacturers and wholesale dealers. They would have been willing to take the Fosters' word for every statement the brothers had made on New Year's Day, but this, it was evident, would not have satisfied their masters, who were scrupulous in insisting that whatever advantage there was should always fall on the side of the younger men. When Philip saw Sylvia, she was always quiet and gentle, perhaps more silent than she had been a year ago, and she did not attend so briskly to what was passing around her. She was rather thinner and paler, but whatever change there was in her was always an improvement in Philip's eyes, so long as she spoke graciously to him. He thought she was suffering from long-continued anxiety about her mother, or that she had too much to do, and either cause was enough to make him treat her with a grave regard and deference, which had a repressed tenderness in it, of which she, otherwise occupied, was quite unaware. She liked him better, too, than she had done a year or two before, because he did not show her any of the eager attention which teased her then, although its meaning was not fully understood. Things were much in this state when the frost broke, and milder weather succeeded. This was the time so long looked forward to by the invalid and her friends, as favouring the doctor's recommendation of change of air. Her husband was to take her to spend a fortnight with a kindly neighbour who lived near the farm they had occupied 40 miles or so inland before they came to Haytersbank. The widow woman was to come and stay in the house, to keep Sylvia company during her mother's absence. Daniel, indeed, was to return home after conveying his wife to her destination, but there was so much to be done on the land at this time of the year that Sylvia would have been alone all day had it not been for the arrangement just mentioned. There was an active stirring in Monkshaven harbour as well as on shore. The whalers were finishing their fittings out for the Greenland seas. It was a close season. That is to say, there would be difficulty in passing the barrier of ice which lay between the ships and the whaling grounds. And yet these must be reached before June, or the year's expedition would be of little avail. Every blacksmith shop rung with the rhythmical clang of busy hammers, beating out old iron such as horseshoes, nails, or stubs, into the great harpoons. The quays were thronged with busy and important sailors, rushing hither and thither, conscious of the demand in which they were held at this season of the year. It was wartime, too. Many captains unable to procure men in Monkshaven would have to complete their crews in the Shetlands. The shops in the town were equally busy. Stores had to be purchased by the whaling masters, warm clothing of all sorts to be provided. These were the larger wholesale orders, but many a man and woman, too, brought out their small hoards to purchase extra comforts, or precious keepsakes for some beloved one. It was the time of the great half-yearly traffic of the place. Another impetus was given to business when the whalers returned in the autumn, and the men were flush of money, and full of delight at once more seeing their homes and their friends. There was much to be done in Foster's shop, and later hours were kept than usual. Some perplexity or other was occupying John and Jeremiah Foster. Their minds were not so much on the alert as usual, being engaged on some weighty matter of which they had not yet spoken to no one. But it thus happened that they did not give the prompt assistance they were accustomed to render at such times, and Coulson had been away on some of the new expeditions devolving on him and Philip as future partners. One evening after the shop was closed, while they were examining the goods and comparing the sales with the entries in the daybook, Coulson suddenly inquired, "By the way, Hester, does thee know where the parcel of the best bandanas is gone? There was 4 left, as I'm pretty sure, when I set off to Sandsend, and today Mark Alderson came in and would fain have had one, and I could not find none nowhere." "I sold t' last today, to yon sailor, the Specksioneer, who fought the press gang same time as poor Dolly was killed. He took it, and 3 yards of yon pink ribbon with it, black and yellow crosses on it, as Philip could never abide. Philip has got 'em in t' book if you'd only look." "Is he here again?" said Philip. "I didn't see him. What brings him here? Where's he known wanted?" "T' shop throng with folks," said Hester, "and he knew his own mind about the handkercher, and didn't tarry long. Just as he was leaving, his eye caught on t' ribbon, and he came back for it. It were when you were serving Mary Dauber, and there was a vast of folk around you." "I wish I had seen him," said Coulson. "I'd have given him a word and a look not had forgotten in a hurry." "Why, what's up?" said Philip, surprised at William's unusual manner, and at the same time rather gratified to find a reflection of his own feelings about Kinraid. Coulson's face was pale with anger, but for a moment or two he seemed uncertain whether he would reply or not. "Up," he said at length. "It's just this. He came after my sister for better nor 2 year, and a better lass. No, nor a prettier in my eyes never broke bread. And then my master saw another girl that he liked better." William almost choked in his endeavour to keep down all appearance of violent anger, and then went on, "And that he played the same game with, as I'd heard tell." "And how did thy sister take it?" said Philip eagerly. "She died in a 6-month," said William. "She forgived him, but it's beyond me. I thought it were him that I heard of to work about Darley, Kinraid, and coming from Newcastle, where Annie lived prentice, and I made inquiry, and it were the same man. And I'll say no more about him, for it stirs to old Adam more than I like or is fitting." Out of respect to him, Philip asked no more questions, although there were many things that he fain would have known. Both Coulson and he went silently and grimly through the remainder of their day's work, independent of any personal interest which either or both of them had, or might have, in Kinraid's being a light of love. This fault of his was one with which the 2 grave, sedate young men had no sympathy. Their hearts were true and constant, whatever else might be their failings, and it is no new thing to damn the faults we have no mind to. Philip wished that it was not so late, or that very evening he would have gone to keep guard over Sylvia in her mother's absence. Nay, perhaps he might have seen reason to give her a warning of some kind. But if he had done so, it would have been locking the stable door after the steed was stolen. Kinraid had turned his steps towards Haytersbank Farm as soon as ever he had completed his purchases. He had only come that afternoon to Monkshaven, and for the sole purpose of seeing Sylvia once more before he went to fulfil his engagement as specksioneer in the Urania, a whaling vessel that was to sail from North Shields on Thursday morning, and this was Monday. Sylvia sat in the house place, her back to the long low window, in order to have all the light the afternoon hour afforded for her work. A basket of her father's unmended stockings was on the little round table beside her, and one was on her left hand, which she supposed herself to be mending, but from time to time she made long pauses, and looked in the fire, and yet there was but little motion of flame, or light in it out of which to conjure visions. It was redd up for the afternoon, covered with a black mass of coal, over which the equally black kettle hung on the crook. In the back kitchen, Dolly Reed, Sylvia's assistant during her mother's absence, chanted a lugubrious ditty, befitting her condition as a widow, while she cleaned tins and cans and milking pails. Perhaps these bustling sounds prevented Sylvia from hearing approaching footsteps coming down the brow with swift advance. At any rate, she started and suddenly stood up as someone entered the open door. It was strange she should be so much startled, for the person who entered had been in her thoughts all during these long pauses. Charlie Kinraid and the story of Crazy Nancy had been the subjects for her dreams for many a day and many a night. Now he stood there, bright and handsome as ever, with just that much timidity in his face, that anxiety as to his welcome, which gave his accost an added charm, could she but have perceived it. But she was so afraid of herself, so unwilling to show what she felt and how much she had been thinking of him in his absence, that her reception seemed cold and still. She did not come forward to meet him. She went crimson to the very roots of her hair, but that in the waning light he could not see. And she shook so that she felt as if she could hardly stand, but the tremor was not visible to him. She wondered if he remembered the kiss that had passed between them on New Year's Eve, the words that had been spoken in the dairy on New Year's Day, the tones, the looks that had accompanied those words. But all she said was, "I didn't think to see you. I thought you had sailed." "I told you I'd come back, didn't I?" said he, still standing with his hat in his hand, waiting to be asked to sit down, and she, in her bashfulness, forgetting to give the invitation, but instead pretending to be attentively mending the stocking she held. Neither could keep quiet and silent long. She felt his eyes were upon her, watching every motion, and grew more and more confused in her expression and behaviour. He was a little taken aback by the nature of his reception, and was not sure at first whether to take the great change in her manner, from what it had been when he last saw her, as a favourable symptom or otherwise. By and by, luckily for him, in some turn of her arm, to reach the scissors on the table, she caught the edge of her work-basket, and down it fell. She stooped to pick up the scattered stockings and ball of worsted, and so did he, and when they rose up, he had fast hold of her hand, and her face was turned away, half ready to cry. "What ails you at me?" he said beseechingly. "You might have forgotten me, and yet I thought we made a bargain against forgetting each other." No answer. He went on. "You've never been out of my thoughts, Sylvia Robson, and I've come back to Monkshaven for naught but to see you once and again afore I go away to the northern seas. It's not 2 hours since I landed at Monkshaven, and I've been near neither kith nor kin as yet, and now I'm here you won't speak to me." "I don't know what to say," she said in a low, almost inaudible tone. Then hardening herself and resolving to speak as if she did not understand his only half-expressed meaning, she lifted up her head, and all but looking at him, while she wrenched her hand out of his, she said, "Mother's gone to Middleham for a visit, and father's out into Ploughfield with Kester. He'll be under for long." Charlie did not speak for a minute or so. Then he said, "You're not as dull as to think I've come all this way to see either your father or your mother. I've great respect for them both, but I'd hardly ha' come all this way to see 'em, and me bound to be back in Shields if I walk every step of the way by Wednesday night. It's that you won't understand my meaning. Sylvia, it's not that you don't, or that you can't." He made no effort to repossess himself on her hand. She was quite silent, and in spite of herself she drew long hard breaths. "I may go back to where I came from," he went on. "I thought to go to sea with the blessed hope to cheer me up in a knowledge o' someone as loved me as I'd left behind. Someone has loved me half as much as I did her, for the measure of my love toward her is so great and mighty, I'd be content with half as much from her, till I taught her to love me more. But if she's a cold heart and cannot care for an honest sailor, why then I'd best go back at once. He made for the door. He must have been pretty sure from some sign or other, or he would never have left it to her womanly pride to give way, and for her to make the next advance. He had not taken 2 steps when she turned quickly towards him and said something, the echo of which, rather the words themselves, reached him. I didn't know you cared for me. You never said so. In an instant he was back at her side, his arm round her in spite of her short struggle, and his eager, passionate voice saying, You never know I loved you, Sylvia. Say it again, and look into my face while you say it, if you can. I last thought you'd be such a woman would come to be as one, and I never looked upon. And this year, ever since I saw you in the kitchen corner sitting crouching by my uncle, I as good as swore as I have you for wife, or never wed at all. And it was not long ere you knowed it, for all you was so coy. And now you have the face. No, you have not the face. Come, my darling, what is it? For she was crying. And on his turning her wet blushing face towards him, the better to look at it, she suddenly hid it in his breast. He lulled and soothed her in his arms, as if she was a weeping child, and he her mother. And then they sat down on the settle together. And when she was more composed, they began to talk. He asked her about her mother, not sorry in his heart at Belle Robson's absence. He had intended, if necessary, to acknowledge his wishes and desires with regard to Sylvia to her parents, but for various reasons he was not sorry that circumstances had given him the chance of seeing her alone and obtaining her promise to marry him without being obliged to tell either her father or her mother at present. I had spent my money pretty free, he said, and I've ne'er a penny to the fore, and your parents may look for something better for you, my pretty. But when I come back fro this voyage, I shall stand a chance of having a share in the Urania, and maybe I shall be a mate as well as specksioneer. I can get a matter of from 70 to 20 pound a voyage, let alone the half-guineas for every well I stake, and 6 shilling a gallon to the oil. And if I keep steady with Forbes and company, they'll make me a master in time, for I've had good schooling, and can work a ship as well as any man. And I'll leave you with your parents, or take a cottage for you nigh at hand. But I would like to have something to the fore, and that I shall have, please God, when we come back in the autumn. I shall go to sea happy now, thinking I've your word. You're not one to go back from it, I'm sure, else it's a long time to leave such a pretty girl as you, and ne'er a chance of a letter reaching you, just to tell you once again how I love you, and to bid you not forget your true love. There'll be no need of that, murmured Sylvia. She was too dizzy with happiness to have attended much to his details, of his worldly prospects, but at the sound of his tender words of love her eager heart was ready to listen. I don't know, he said, wanting to draw her out into more confession of her feelings. There's many a one ready to come after you, and your mother is not over-captivated with me, and there's yon tall fellow of a cousin as looks black at me, for if I'm not mistaken, he's a notion of being sweet on you hisself. Not he, said Sylvia, with some contempt in her tone. He's so full of business, and shop, and o' making money and getting wealth. Aye, but perhaps when he gets a rich man, he'll come and ask my Sylvia to be his wife, and what will she say then? He'll never come asking such a foolish question, she said a little impatiently. He knows what answer he'll get if he did. Kinraid almost said to himself, Your mother favours him, though. But she, weary of a subject she cared nothing about, and eager to identify herself with all his interests, asked him about his plans almost at the same time that he said these last words. And they went on as lovers do, intermixing a great many tender expressions with a very little conversation relating to facts. Dolly Reed came in and went out softly, unheeded by them, but Sylvia's listening ears caught her father's voice as he and Kester returned homewards from their day's work in the plough-field, and she started away and fled upstairs in shy affright, leaving Charlie to explain his presence in the solitary kitchen to her father. He came in, not seeing that anyone was there at first, for they had never thought of lighting a candle. Kinraid stepped forward into the firelight, his purpose of concealing what he had said to Sylvia quite melted away by the cordial welcome her father gave him the instant that he recognised him. Bless thee, lad, who'd ha' thought of seeing thee? Why'd if ever ha' thought of thee at all? It were halfway to Davis Straits. To be sure, t' winter's been a dry season, and throughout maybe interrate on to make a late start. Latest start ever I've made when 9 through March, and we struck 13 wells that year. I have something to say to you, said Charlie, in a hesitating voice, so different to his usual hearty way, that Daniel gave him a keen look of attention before he began to speak, and perhaps the elder man was not unprepared for the communication that followed. At any rate, it was not unwelcome. He liked Kinraid, and had strong sympathy not merely with what he knew of the young sailor's character, but with the life he led and the business he followed. Robson listened to all he said with approving nods and winks, till Charlie had told him everything he had to say, and then he turned and struck his broad, horny palm into Kinraid's, as if concluding a bargain, when he expressed in words his hearty consent to their engagement. He wound up with a chuckle, as the thought struck him that this great piece of business of disposing of their only child had been concluded while his wife was away.
"I'm noan so sure as to Mrs. O'Lackett," he said, "for whatever she'll have to say against it, mischief on I knows. But she's noan keen on matrimony, though I have made her as good as man as ever there is at the ridings. Anyhow, I'm a master, and that she knows. But there may be, for the sake of peace and quietness, though she'll never a scolding tongue, that I will say for her. We had best keep this matter to ourselves till thou comes into port again. The lass upstairs are like naught better than to curl herself around the secret and purr over it, just as the old cat does over her blind kitten. But thou will be wanting to see the lass all be abound. An old man like me isn't as good a company as a pretty lass."
Laughing a low, rich laugh over his own wit, Daniel went to the bottom of the stairs and called, "Sylvie! Sylvie, come down, lass! Asrit, come down!" For a time there was no answer. Then a door was unbolted, and Sylvia said, "I can't come down again. I'm no one coming down again tonight." Daniel laughed the more at this, especially when he caught Charlie's look of disappointment.
"Hearken how she bolted the door. She'll no one come near us this night. But she's a stiff little one, and she's been our only one, and we'll mostly let her have her own way. But we'll have a pipe and a glass, and that to my thinking is as good company as ever a woman in Yorkshire."
End of Chapter 16. Recording by Lauren McCullough. www.laurenmccullough.com. Of Sylvia's Lovers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lauren McCullough. Sylvia's Lovers by Elizabeth Gaskell. Chapter 17. The post arrived at Monkshaven 3 times in the week. Sometimes, indeed, there were not a dozen letters in the bag, which was brought thither by a man in a light mail cart, who took the better part of the day to drive from York, dropping private bags here and there on the moors, at some squire's lodge or roadside inn. Of the number of letters that arrived in Monkshaven, the Fosters, shopkeepers, and bankers had the largest share. The morning succeeding the day on which Sylvia had engaged herself to Kinraid, the Fosters seemed unusually anxious to obtain their letters. Several times Jeremiah came out of the parlour in which his brother John was sitting in expectant silence, and passing through the shop looked up and down the marketplace in search of the old lame woman who was charitably employed to deliver letters, and who must have been lamer than ever this morning, to judge from the lateness of her coming. Although none but the Fosters knew the cause of their impatience for their letters, yet there was such tacit sympathy between them and those whom they employed, that Hepburn, Coulson, and Hester were all much relieved when the old woman at length appeared with her basket of letters. One of these seemed of especial consequence to the good brothers. They each separately looked at the direction, and then at one another, and without a word they returned with it unread into the parlour, shutting the door, and drawing the green silk curtain close, the better to read it in privacy. Both Coulson and Philip felt that something unusual was going on, and were, perhaps, as full of consideration as to the possible contents of this London letter, as of the attention to their more immediate business. But fortunately there was little doing in the shop. Philip indeed was quite idle when John Foster opened the parlour door, and half-doubtedly called him into the room. As the door of communication shut the three in, Coulson felt himself a little aggrieved. A minute ago Philip and he were on a level of ignorance, from which the former was evidently going to be raised. But he soon returned to his usual state of acquiescence in things as they were, which was partly constitutional and partly the result of his Quaker training. It was apparently by John Foster's wish that Philip had been summoned. Jeremiah, the less energetic and decided brother, was still discussing the propriety of the step when Philip entered. "No need for haste, John. Better not call the young man in till we have further considered the matter." But the young man was there in presence, and John's will carried the day. It seemed from his account to Philip, explanatory of what he, in advance of his brother's slower judgment, thought to be a necessary step, that the Fosters had for some time received anonymous letters warning them, with distinct meaning, though in ambiguous terms, against a certain silk manufacturer in Spitalfields, with whom they had had straightforward business dealings for many years, but to whom they had latterly advanced money. The letters hinted at the utter insolvency of this manufacturer. They had urged their correspondent to give them his name in confidence, and this morning's letter had brought it, but the name was totally unknown to them, though there seemed no reason to doubt the reality of either it or the address, the latter of which was given in full. Certain circumstances were mentioned regarding the transactions between the Fosters and this manufacturer, which could be known only to those who were in the confidence of one or the other, and to the Fosters the man was, as has been said, a perfect stranger. Probably they would have been unwilling to incur the risk they had done on this manufacturer Dickinson's account, if it had not been that he belonged to the same denomination as themselves, and was publicly distinguished for his excellent and philanthropic character. But these letters were provocative of anxiety, especially since this morning's post had brought out the writer's full name, and various particulars showing his intimate knowledge of Dickinson's affairs. After much perplexed consultation, John had hit upon the plan of sending Hepburn to London to make secret inquiries respecting the true character and commercial position of the man whose creditors, not a month ago, they had esteemed it an honour to be. Even now Jeremiah was ashamed of their want of confidence in one so good. He believed that the information they had received would all prove a mistake, founded on erroneous grounds, if not a pure invention of an enemy, and he had only been brought partially to consent to the sending of Hepburn by his brother's pledging himself that the real nature of Philip's errand should be unknown to any human creature save them three. As all this was being revealed to Philip, he sat apparently unmoved and simply attentive. In fact, he was giving all his mind to understanding the probabilities of the case, leaving his own feelings in the background till his intellect should have done its work. He said little, but what he did say was to the point, and satisfied both brothers. John perceived that his messenger would exercise penetration and act with energy, while Jeremiah was soothed by Philip's caution in not hastily admitting the probability of any charge against Dickinson, and in giving full weight to his previous good conduct and good character. Philip had the satisfaction of feeling himself employed on a mission which would call out his powers, and yet not exceed them. In his own mind he forestalled the instructions of his masters, and was silently in advance of John Foster's plans and arrangements, while he appeared to listen to all that was said with quiet business-like attention. It was settled that the next morning he was to make his way northwards to Hartlepool, whence he could easily proceed either by land or sea to Newcastle, from which place smacks were constantly sailing to London. As to his personal conduct and behaviour there, the brothers overwhelmed him with directions and advice, nor did they fail to draw out the strong box in the thick wall of their counting-house, a more than sufficient sum of money for all possible expenses. Philip had never had so much in his hands before, and hesitated to take it, saying it was more than he should require. But they repeated, with fresh urgency, their warnings about the terrible high prices of London, till he could only resolve to keep a strict account, and bring back all that he did not expend, since nothing but his taking the whole sum would satisfy his employers. When he was once more behind the counter, he had leisure enough for consideration as far as Coulson could give it him. The latter was silent, brooding over the confidence which Philip had apparently received, but which was withheld from him. He did not yet know of the culminating point of Philip's proposed journey to London, that great city of London, which from its very inaccessibility 50 years ago, loomed so magnificent through the mist of men's imaginations. It is not to be denied that Philip felt exultant at the mere fact of going to London. But then again, the thought of leaving Sylvia, of going out of the possible daily reach of her, of not seeing her for a week, a fortnight, nay, he might be away for a month. For no rash hurry was to mar his delicate negotiation, gnawed at his heart, and spoilt any enjoyment he might have anticipated, from gratified curiosity, or even from the consciousness of being trusted by those whose trust and regard he valued. The sense of what he was leaving grew upon him the longer he thought on the subject. He almost wished he had told his masters earlier in the conversation of his unwillingness to leave Monkshaven for so long a time. And then again, he felt that the gratitude he owed them quite prohibited his declining any task they might impose, especially as they had more than once said that it would not do for them to appear in the affair, and yet to no one else could they entrust so difficult and delicate a matter. Several times that day, as he perceived Coulson's jealous sullenness, he thought in his heart that the consequence of the excessive confidence for which Coulson envied him was a burden from which he would be thankful to be relieved. As they all sat at tea in Alice Rose's house place, Philip announced his intended journey, a piece of intelligence he had not communicated earlier to Coulson, because he had rather dreaded the increase of dissatisfaction it was sure to produce, and of which he knew the expression would be restrained by the presence of Alice Rose and her daughter. "To Lunnon!" exclaimed Alice. Hester said nothing. "Well, some folks have all the luck," said Coulson. "Luck?" said Alice, turning sharp round on him. "Niver let me hear such a vain word out of thy mouth, laddie, again. It's the Lord's doing, and the luck's the devil's way of putting it. Maybe it's to try Philip he's sent there. Happen it might be a fiery furnace to him, for I've heard tell it's full of temptations, and he may fall into sin, and then where'd be the luck on it? But why art to goin'? And the morning, sayest thou? Why, thy best shirts is in the suds, and no time to stash and iron it. What in the great haste should take thee to Lunnon without thy ruffled shirt?" "It's none of my doing," said Philip. "There's business to be done, and John Foster says I'm to do it, and I'm to start tomorrow." "I'll not turn thee out without thy ruffled shirt, if I sit up and eat," said Alice resolutely. "Niver fret thyself, mother, about the shirt," said Philip. "If I need a shirt, London's not what I take it for if I can't buy myself one ready-made." "Hearken to him," said Alice. "He speaks as if buying or ready-made shirts were naught to him, and he with a good half-dozen as I made myself. Eh, lad? But if that's the frame of mind thou art in, Lunnon is like for to be a sore place o' temptation. There's pitfalls for men and traps for money in every turn, as I've heard say. It would have been better if John Foster had sent an older man on his business, whatever it be." "They seem to make a deal of Philip all of a sudden," said Coulson. "He's sent for and talked to in privacy, while Hester and me is left out in the shop to bear the brunt of serving." "Philip knows," said Hester, and then somehow her voice failed her and she stopped. Philip paid no attention to this half-uttered sentence. He was eager to tell Coulson, as far as he could do so without betraying his master's secret, how many drawbacks there were to his proposed journey, and the responsibility which it involved, and his unwillingness to leave Monkshaven. He said, "Coulson, I'd give a deal it were thou that were going, and not me. At least there is many a time I'd give a deal. I'll not deny but at other times I'm pleased at the thought on it. But if I could, I'd change places with thee at this moment." "It's fine talking," said Coulson, half mollified, and yet not caring to show it. "I make no doubt it were an even chance betwixt us two at first, which on us was to go, but somehow thou got the start and thou hast stuck to it, till it's too late for aught but to say thou's sorry." "Nay, William," said Philip, rising, "it's an ill look out for the future, if thee and me is to quarrel, like two silly wenches, o'er each a bit of pleasure, or what thou fancies to be pleasure, as falls into way of either on us. I've said truth to thee, and played thee fair, and I've got to go to Harrisbank for to wish him goodbye, so I'll not stay longer here to be misdoubted by thee." He took his cap and was gone, not heeding Alice's shrill inquiry as to his clothes and his ruffled shirt. Coulson sat still, penitent and ashamed. At length he stole a look at Hester. She was playing with her teaspoon, but he could see that she was choking down her tears. He could not choose but force to speak with an ill-timed question. "What's to do, Hester?" said he. She lifted up those eyes, usually so soft and serene. Now they were full of the light of indignation shining through tears. "To do," she said. "Coulson, I thought better of thee, going and doubting and envying Philip as never did thee an ill turn, or said an ill word, or thought an ill thought by thee, and sending him away out on the house this last night of all, maybe with thy envyings and jealousy." She hastily got up and left the room. Alice was away, looking up Philip's things for his journey. Coulson remained alone, feeling like a guilty child, but dismayed by Hester's words, even more than by his own regret at what he had said. Philip walked rapidly up the hill towards Haytersbank. He was chafed and excited by Coulson's words and the events of the day. He meant to shape his life, and now it was, as it were, being shaped for him. and yet he was reproached for the course it was taken, as much as though he were an active agent, accused of taking advantage over Coulson, his intimate companion for years. He who esteemed himself above taking an unfair advantage over any man. His feeling on the subject was akin to that of Hazael. Is thy servant a dog, that he should do this thing? His feelings, disturbed on this one point, shook his judgment off its balance on another. The resolution he had deliberately formed of not speaking to Sylvia on the subject of his love till he could announce to her parents the fact of his succession to Foster's business, until he had patiently, with long continuing and deep affection, worked his way into her regard, was set aside during the present walk. He would speak to her of his passionate attachment before he left for an uncertain length of time and the certain distance of London, and all the modification on this point which his judgment could obtain from his impetuous and excited heart was that he would watch her words and manner well when he announced his approaching absence, and if in them he read the slightest token of tender regretful feeling, he would pour out his love at her feet, not even urging the young girl to make any return or to express the feelings of which he hoped the germ was already budding in her. He would be patient with her. He could not be patient himself. His heart beating, his busy mind rehearsing the probable coming scene, he turned into the field path that led to Haytersbank. Coming along it, and so meeting him, advanced Daniel Robson, in earnest talk with Charlie Kinraid. Kinraid, then, had been at the farm. Kinraid had been seeing Sylvia, her mother, away. The thought of poor dead Annie Coulson flashed into Philip's mind. Could he be playing the same game with Sylvia? Philip set his teeth and tightened his lips at the thought of it. They had stopped talking. They had seen him already, or his impulse would have been to dodge behind the wall and avoid them, even though one of his purposes in going to Haytersbank had been to bid his uncle farewell. Kinraid took him by surprise from the hearty greeting he gave him, in which Philip would fain have avoided, but the specksioneer was full of kindliness towards all the world, especially towards all Sylvia's friends, and convinced of her great love towards himself, had forgotten any previous jealousy of Philip. Secure and exultant, his broad, handsome, weather-bronzed face was as great a contrast to Philip's long, thoughtful, sallow countenance as his frank manner was to the other's cold reserve. It was some minutes before Hepburn could bring himself to tell the great event that was about to befall him before this third person whom he considered an intrusive stranger. But as Kinraid seemed to have no idea of going on, as there really was no reason why he and all the world should not know of Philip's intentions, he told his uncle that he was bound for London the next day on business connected with the Fosters. Daniel was deeply struck with the fact that he was talking to a man setting off for London at a day's notice.
"Ta never telled me this hasn't been brewing longer nor 12 hours. Thou's a sly, close chap, and we hadn't seen thee this se'night. Thou'll ha' been thinking on this, and conjugating it, maybe, at that time."
"Nay," said Philip, "I knew naught about it last night. It's none of my doing, going, for I'd liefer ha' stayed where I am." "You'll like it when once you're there," said Kinraid, with a travelled air of superiority, as Philip fancied. "No, I shan't," he replied shortly. "Liking has naught to do with it."
"Aye, you knew naught about it last neet,"
continued Daniel musingly.
"Well, life's soon over, else when I was a young fella, folks made their wills afore going to London."
"Yet, I'll be bound to say you never made a will before going to sea," said Philip, half smiling.
Nah, but that's quite another make o' thing. Going to sea comes natural to a man, but going to London, I were once there, and were near deafened with the throng and the sound. I were but 2 hours into place, though our ship lay a fortnight off Gravesend."
Kinraid now seemed in a hurry, but Philip was stung with curiosity to ascertain his movements, and suddenly addressed him.
"I heard you were in these parts. Are you staying here for long?"
There was a certain abruptness in Philip's tone, if not in his words, which made Kinraid look in his face with surprise, and answer with equal curtness.
"I'm off in the morning,
and sail for the North Seas day after." He turned away and began to whistle, as if he did not wish for any further conversation with his interrogator. Philip, indeed, had nothing more to say to him. He had learned all he wanted to know.
"I'd like to bid goodbye to Sylvia. Is she at home?"
he asked of her father.
"I'm thinking thou'lt not find her. She'll be off to Yesterbarrow to see if she'd get to setting o' the eggs. Her grey speckled hen is clucking, and naught'll serve our Sylvia but the eggs to set her upon. But for that, she mayn't be gone yet. Best go and see for thyself."
So they parted, but Philip had not gone many steps before his uncle called him back. Kinraid slowly loitering on meanwhile. Robson was fumbling among some dirty papers he had in an old leather case, which he had produced out of his pocket.
Fact is, Philip, t' plough's in a bad way. Gearin' and folk is talking on a new kind I'll make, and if thou's bound for York...
I'm not going by York. I'm going by a Newcastle smack.
Newcastle, it's pretty much the same. Here, lad, thou can read print easy. It's a bit as was cut out of a paper. There's Newcastle and York and Durham, and a vast more towns named, where folk can learn about a new make o' plough.
I see, said Philip.
Robinson side Newcastle can give all requisite information.
Aye, said Robson.
Thou'lt hit tomorrow on tomato. Now if thou art in Newcastle, thou can learn all about it. Thou art little better nor a woman, for sure, being mainly acquaint with the ribbons. But they'll tell thee, lad. And write down what they're saying, and what's to be to price, and look sharp as to what kind of folk they are as sells them, and write, and let me know. Thou'll be in Newcastle tomorrow, maybe. Well then, I'll reckon to hear from thee in a week, or mayhap less. For t' land is backward, and I like to know about the ploughs. I'd a month's mind to write to Brunton, as Mary Molly Comey, but the writing is more in thy way, and Tarson's no mine. And if thou sells ribbons, Brunton sells cheese, and that's no better.
Philip promised to do his best, and to write word to Robson, who, satisfied with his willingness to undertake the commission, bade him go on and see if he could not find the lass. Her father was right in saying that she might not have set out for Yesterbarrow. She had talked about it to Kinraid and her father in order to cover her regret at her lover's accompanying her father to see some new kind of harpoon about which the latter had spoken. But as soon as they had left the house, and she had covertly watched them up the brow in the field, she sat down to meditate and dream about her great happiness in being beloved by her hero, Charlie Kinraid. No gloomy dread of his long summer's absence, no fear of the cold, glittering icebergs bearing mercilessly down on the Urania, nor shuddering anticipation of the dark waves of evil import crossed her mind. He loved her, and that was enough. Her eyes looked trance-like into a dim, glorious future of life. Her lips, still warm and reddened by his kiss, were just parted in a happy smile, when she was startled by the sound of an approaching footstep, a footstep quite familiar enough for her to recognize it, and which was unwelcome now, as disturbing her in the one blessed subject of thought in which alone she cared to indulge.
"Well, Philip, and what brings you here?"
was her rather ungracious greeting.
"Why, Sylvie, are you sorry to see me?"
said Philip reproachfully, but she turned it off with assumed lightness.
"Oh, yes," said she. "I've been wanting you this week past, with to match to my blue ribbon you said you'd get, and bring me the next time you came."
"I've forgotten, Sylvie. It's clean gone out of my mind," said Philip, with true regret.
"But I've had a great deal to think on,"
he continued, penitently, as if anxious to be forgiven. Sylvia did not want his penitence, did not care for her ribbon, was troubled by his earnestness of manner, but he knew nothing of all that. He only knew that she, whom he loved, had asked him to do something for her, and he had neglected it. So anxious to be excused and forgiven, he went on with the apology she cared not to hear. If she had been less occupied with her own affairs, less engrossed with deep feeling, she would have reproached him, if only in jest, for his carelessness. As it was, she scarcely took in the sense of his words.
"You see, Sylvie, I've had a deal to think on. Before long I intend to telling you all about it. Just now I'm not free to do it. And when a man's mind is full of business, most particular when it's other folks as is trusted to him, he seems to lose count of the very things he'd most care for at another time."
He paused a little. Sylvia's galloping thoughts were pulled suddenly up by his silence. She felt that he wanted her to say something, but she could think of nothing besides an ambiguous, "Well?" "And I'm off to London in t' morning," he said, a little wistfully, almost as if beseeching her to show or express some sorrow at a journey, the very destination of which showed that he would be absent for some time.
"To Lunnon?" she said with some surprise. "You never thinking of going to live there for sure?"
Surprise and curiosity and wonder, nothing more, as Philip's instinct told him. But he reasoned that first correct impression away with ingenious sophistry.
"Not to live there, only to stay for some time. I shall be back, I reckon, in a month or so."
"Oh,
that's not of a going away," she said rather petulantly. "Them as go to Greenland seas has to bide away for 6 months and more," and she sighed.
Suddenly a light shone down into Philip's mind. His voice was changed as he spoke next.
I met that good-for-nothing chap Kinraid with your father just now. He'll ha' been here, Sylvie.
She stooped for something she had dropped and came up red as a rose. To be sure. What then? And she eyed him defiantly, though in her heart she trembled, she knew not why. What then? And your mother away? He's no company for such as thee. At no time, Sylvie. Feather and me chooses our own company, without ever asking leave of you, said Sylvia, hastily arranging the things in the little wooden workbox that was on the table, preparatory to putting it away. At the time, in his agitation, he saw, but did not affix any meaning to it, that the half of some silver coin was among the contents thus turned over before the box was locked. But thy mother wouldn't like it, Sylvie. He's played false with other lasses. He'll be playing thee false some of these days, if thou lets him come about thee. He went on with Annie Coulson, William's sister, till he broke her heart, and sin then he's been on with others. I do not believe a word on it, said Sylvia, standing up all aflame. I never told a lie in my life, said Philip, almost choking with grief at her manner to him, and the regard for his rival which she betrayed. It were Willie Coulson as telled me, as solemn and serious as one man can speak to another, and he said it weren't the first, nor the last time as he made his own game with young women. And how dare you come here to me with your backbiting tales? Said Sylvia, shivering all over with passion. Philip tried to calm his voice and to explain. It were your own mother, Sylvia, as knowed you had no brother, or any one to see after you. And you're so pretty, Sylvia, he continued, shaking his head sadly, that men run after you against their will, as one may say. And your mother bade me watch over ye, and see what company you kept, and who was following after you, and to warn you, if need were. My mother never bade you to come spying after me, and blaming me for seeing a lad as my feather thinks well on. And I don't believe a word about Annie Coulson, and I'm not going to suffer you to come with your tales to me. Say him out to his face, and hear what he'll say to you. Sylvie, cried poor Philip as his offended cousin rushed past him and upstairs to her little bedroom, where he heard the sound of the wooden bolt flying into its place. He could hear her feet pacing quickly about the unsealed rafters. He sat still in despair, his head buried in his two hands. He sat till it grew dusk, dark. The wood fire, not gathered together by careful hands, died out into grey ashes. Dolly Reed had done her work and gone home. There were but Philip and Sylvia in the house. He knew he ought to be going home, for he had much to do and many arrangements to make, yet it seemed as though he could not stir. At length he raised his stiffened body and stood up, dizzy. Up the little wooden stairs he went, where he had never been before, to the small square landing almost filled up with the great chest for oat cake. He breathed hard for a minute, and then knocked at the door of Sylvia's room. Sylvie, I'm going away. Say goodbye. No answer. Not a sound heard. Sylvie! A little louder and less hoarsely spoken. There was no reply. Sylvie! I shall be a long time away. Perhaps I may never come back at all. Here he bitterly thought of an unregarded death. Say goodbye. No answer. He waited patiently. Can she be wearied out and gone to sleep, he wondered? Yet once again. Goodbye, Sylvie. And God bless you. I'm sorry I vexed you. No reply. With a heavy, heavy heart, he creaked down the stairs, felt for his cap, and left the house. She's warned me, anyway, thought he. Just at that moment, the little casement window of Sylvia's room was opened, and she said, Goodbye, Philip. The window was shut again as soon as the words were spoken. Philip knew the uselessness of remaining, the need for his departure, and yet he stood still for a little time like one entranced, as if his will had lost all power to compel him to leave the place. Those 2 words of hers, which 2 hours before would have been so far beneath his aspirations, had now power to relight hope, to quench reproach or blame. She's but a young lassie, he said to himself, and Kinraid has been playing with her, as such as he can't help doing, once they get among the women. And I came down sudden on her about Annie Coulson, and touched her pride. Maybe, too, it were ill-advised to tell her how her mother had feared for her. I couldn't have left the place tomorrow if he'd been biding here, but he's off for half a year or so, and I'll be home again as soon as ever I can. In half a year such as he forgets, if ever he's thought serious about her, but in my lifetime, if I lived 80, I can never forget. God bless her for saying goodbye, Philip. He repeated the words aloud in fond mimicry of her tones. Goodbye, Philip. End of Chapter 17. Recording by Lauren McCullough. www.laurenmccullough.com.
Of Sylvia's Lovers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kate Mackenzie. Sylvia's Lovers by Elizabeth Gaskell. Chapter 18. Eddy in Love's Current. The next morning shone bright and clear, if ever a March morning did. The beguiling month was coming in like a lamb, with whatever storms it might go raging out. It was long since Philip had tasted the freshness of the early air on the shore or in the country, as his employment at the shop detained him in Monkshaven till the evening; and as he turned down the quays, or staithes, on the north side of the river towards the shore, and met the fresh sea breeze blowing right in his face, it was impossible not to feel bright and elastic. With his knapsack slung over his shoulder, he was prepared for a good stretch towards Hartlepool, whence a coach would take him to Newcastle before night. For 7 or 8 miles the level sands were a short and far more agreeable a road than the up and down landways. Philip walked on pretty briskly, unconsciously enjoying the sunny landscape before him, the crisp curling waves rushing almost up to his feet on his right hand, and then swishing back over the fine small pebbles into the great swelling sea. To his left were the cliffs, rising one behind another, having deep gullies here and there between, with long green slopes upward from the land, and then sudden falls of brown and red soil or rock, deepening to a yet greater richness of colour at their base towards the blue ocean before him. The loud monotonous murmur of the advancing and receding waters lulled him into dreaminess. The sunny look of everything tinged his daydreams with hope. So he trudged merrily over the first mile or so, not an obstacle to his measured pace on the hard level pavement, not a creature to be seen since he had left the little gathering of bare-legged urchins dabbling in the sea-pools near Monkshaven. The cares of land were shut out by the glorious barrier of rocks before him. There were some great masses that had been detached by the action of the weather, and lay half embedded in the sand, draperied over by the heavy pendant olive-green seaweed. The waves were nearer at this point, the advancing sea came up with a mighty distant length of roar. Here and there the smooth swell was lashed by the fret against unseen rocks into white breakers, but otherwise the waves came up from the German Ocean upon that English shore with a long steady roll that might have taken its first impetus far away, in the haunt of the sea serpent on the coast of Norroway over the foam. The air was soft as May. Right overhead the sky was blue, but it deadened into grey near the sea lines. Flocks of seagulls hovered about the edge of the waves, slowly rising and turning their white underplumage to glimmer in the sunlight as Philip approached. The whole scene was so peaceful, so soothing, that it dispelled the cares and fears, too well founded in fact, which had weighed down on his heart during the dark hours of the past night. There was Haytersbank Gully opening down its green entrance among the warm brown bases of the cliffs. Below, in the sheltered brushwood, among the last year's withered leaves, some primroses might be found. He half thought of gathering Sylvia a posy of them and rushing up to the farm to make a little farewell peace offering, but on looking at his watch he put all thoughts of such an action out of his head. It was above an hour later than he had supposed, and he must make all haste on to Hartlepool. Just as he was approaching this gully a man came dashing down, and ran out some way upon the sand with the very force of his descent. Then he turned to the left and took the direction of Hartlepool 100 yards or so in advance of Philip. He never stayed to look round him, but went swiftly and steadily on his way. By the peculiar lurch in his walk, by everything, Philip knew it was the specksioneer, Kinraid. Now the road up Haytersbank Gully led to the farm, and nowhere else. Still, anyone wishing to descend to the shore might do so by first going up to the Robsons' house and skirting the walls till they came to the little slender path down to the shore. But by the farm, by the very house door, they must of necessity pass. Philip slackened his pace, keeping under the shadow of the rock. By and by Kinraid, walking on the sunlight open sands, turned round and looked long and earnestly towards Haytersbank Gully. Hepburn paused when he paused, but as intently as he looked at some object above, so intently did Hepburn look at him. No need to ascertain by sight towards whom his looks, his thoughts were directed. He took off his hat and waved it, touching one part of it as if with particular meaning. When he turned away at last, Hepburn heaved a heavy sigh, and crept yet more into the cold dank shadow of the cliffs. Each step was now a heavy task, his sad heart tired and weary. After a while he climbed up a few feet, so as to mingle his form yet more completely with the stones and rocks around. Stumbling over the uneven and often jagged points, slipping on the seaweed, plunging into little pools of water left by the ebbing tide in some natural basins, he kept yet his eyes fixed as if in fascination on Kinraid, and made his way almost alongside of him. But the last hour had pinched Hepburn's features into something of the wan haggardness they would wear when he should first be lying still for ever. And now the two men were drawing near a creek, about 8 miles from Monkshaven. The creek was formed by a beck, or small stream, that came flowing down from the moors, and took its way to the sea between the widening rocks. The melting of the snows and running of the flooded water springs above made this beck in the early springtime both deep and wide. Hepburn knew that here they both must take a path leading inland to a narrow footbridge about 1/4 mile up the stream. Indeed, from this point, owing to the jutting out of the rocks, the land path was the shortest, and this way lay by the waterside at an angle right below the cliff to which Hepburn's steps were leading him. He knew that on this long level field path he might easily be seen by any one following, nay, if he followed any one at a short distance, for it was full of turnings; and he resolved, late as he was, to sit down for a while till Kinraid was far enough in advance for him to escape being seen. He came up to the last rock behind which he could be concealed. 7 or 8 feet above the stream he stood, and looked cautiously for the specksioneer. Up by the rushing stream he looked, then right below. "It is God's providence," he murmured. "It is God's providence." He crouched down where he had been standing, and covered his face with his hands. He tried to deafen as well as to blind himself, that he might neither hear nor see anything of the coming event of which he, an inhabitant of Monkshaven at that day, well understood the betokening signs. Kinraid had taken the larger angle of the sands before turning up towards the bridge. He came along now nearing the rocks. By this time he was sufficiently buoyant to whistle to himself. It steeled Philip's heart to what was coming, to hear his rival whistling "Weel may the keel row" so soon after parting with Sylvia. The instant Kinraid turned the corner of the cliff, the ambush was upon him. 4 man-of-war's men sprang on him, and strove to pinion him. "In the King's name!" cried they, with rough triumphant jeers. Their boat was moored not a dozen yards above. They were sent by the tender of a frigate lying off Hartlepool for fresh water. The tender was at anchor just beyond the jutting rocks in face. They knew that fishermen were in the habit of going to and from their nets by the side of the creek, but such a prize as this, active, strong, and evidently superior sailor, was what they had not hoped for, and their endeavours to secure him were in proportion to the value of the prize. Although taken by surprise and attacked by so many, Kinraid did not lose his wits. He wrenched himself free, crying out loud, "Avast! I'm a protected whaler. I claim my protection. I've my papers to show. I'm bonded specksioneer to the Urania whaler, Donkin Captain, North Shields Port." As a protected whaler, the press gang had, by the 17th section of Act 26 George III, no legal right to seize him, unless he had failed to return to his ship by the 10th of March following the date of his bond. But of what use were the papers he hastily dragged out of his breast? Of what use were laws in those days of slow intercourse with such as were powerful enough to protect, and in the same time of popular panic against a French invasion? "Damn your protection!" cried the leader of the press gang. "Come and serve his Majesty. That's better than catching whales." "Is it though?" said the specksioneer with a motion of his hand, which the swift-eyed sailor opposed to him saw and interpreted rightly. Thou wilt thou? Close with him, Jack, and wear the cutlass." In a minute his cutlass was forced from him, and it became a hand-to-hand struggle of which, from the difference in numbers, it was not difficult to foretell the result. Yet Kinraid made desperate efforts to free himself. He wasted no breath in words, but fought, as the men said, like a very devil. Hepburn heard loud pants of breath, great thuds, the dull struggle of limbs on the sand, the growling curses of those who thought to have managed their affair more easily, the sudden cry of some one wounded. Not Kinraid, he knew. Kinraid would have borne any pain in silence at such a moment. Another wrestling, swearing, infuriated strife, and then a strange silence. Hepburn sickened at the heart. Was then his rival dead? Had he left this bright world? Lost his life, his love? For an instant Hepburn felt guilty of his death. He said to himself he had never wished him dead, and yet in the struggle he had kept aloof, and now it might be too late for ever. Philip could not bear the suspense. He looked stealthily round the corner of the rock behind which he had been hidden, and saw that they had overpowered Kinraid, and, too exhausted to speak, were binding him hand and foot to carry him to their boat. Kinraid lay as still as any hedgehog. He rolled when they pushed him. He suffered himself to be dragged without any resistance, any motion. The strong colour brought into his face while fighting was gone now. His countenance was livid pale. His lips were tightly held together, as if it cost him more effort to be passive, wooden, and stiff in their hands than it had done to fight and struggle with all his might. His eyes seemed the only part about him that showed cognizance of what was going on. They were watchful, vivid, fierce, as those of a wild cat brought to bay, seeking in its desperate quickened brain for some mode of escape not yet visible, and in all probability never to become visible to the hopeless creature in its supreme agony. Without a motion of his head he was perceiving and taking in everything while he lay bound at the bottom of the boat. A sailor sat by his side, who had been hurt by a blow from him. The man held his head in his hand, moaning, but every now and then he revenged himself by a kick at the prostrate specksioneer, till even his comrades stopped their cursing and swearing at the prisoner for the trouble he had given them, to cry shame on their comrade. But Kinraid never spoke, nor shrank from the outstretched foot. One of his captors, with the successful insolence of victory, ventured to jeer him on the supposed reason for his vehement and hopeless resistance. He might have said yet more insolent things. The kicks might have hit harder. Kinraid did not hear or heed. His soul was beating itself against the bars of inflexible circumstance, reviewing in one terrible instant of time what had been, what might have been, what was. Yet while these thoughts thus stabbed him, he was still mechanically looking out for chances. He moved his head a little, so as to turn towards Haytersbank, where Sylvia must be, quickly, if sadly, going about her simple daily work. And then his quick eye caught Hepburn's face, blanched with excitement rather than fear, watching eagerly from behind the rock, where he had sat breathless during the affray and the impressment of his rival. "Come here, lad!" shouted the specksioneer as soon as he saw Philip heaving and writhing his body the while with so much vigour that the sailors started away from the work they were engaged in about the boat, and held him down once more, as if afraid he should break the strong rope that held him like withes of green flax. But the bound man had no such notion in his head. His mighty wish was to call Hepburn near, that he might send some message by him to Sylvia. "Come here, Hepburn!" he cried again, falling back this time so weak and exhausted that the man of war's men became sympathetic. "Come down, Peeping Tom, and don't be afeared," they called out. "I'm not afeared," said Philip. "I'm no sailor for you to impress me, nor have you any right to take that fellow. He's a Greenland specksioneer under protection, as I know and can testify." "Yo and you'll testify go wang. Make haste, man, and hear what this gemman, as was in a dirty blubbery whale ship, and is now in his Majesty's service, has got to say. I dare say, Jack," went on the speaker, "it's some message to his sweetheart, asking her to come for to serve on board ship along with thee, like Billy Taylor's young woman." Philip was coming towards them slowly, not from want of activity, but because he was undecided what he should be called upon to do or to say by the man whom he hated and dreaded, yet whom just now he could not help admiring. Kinraid groaned with impatience at seeing one, free to move with quick decision, so slow and dilatory. "Come on, then," cried the sailors, "or we'll take you two on board, and run you up and down mainmast a few times. Nothing like life aboard ship for quickening a landlubber." "You'd better take him and leave me," said Kinraid grimly. "I've been taught my lesson, and seemingly he has his yet to learn. His Majesty isn't a schoolmaster to need scholars, but a jolly good captain to need men," replied the leader of the gang, eyeing Philip nevertheless, and questioning within himself how far, with only two other available men, they durst venture on his capture as well as the specksioneers. It might be done, he thought, even though there was this powerful captain aboard, and the boat to manage too. But, running his eye over Philip's figure, he decided that the tall stooping fellow was never cut out for a sailor, and that he should get small thanks if he captured him, to pay him for the possible risk of losing the other. Or else the mere fact of being a landsman was of as little consequence to the press gang as the protecting papers which Kinraid had vainly showed. "Yon fellow wouldn't have been worth his grog this many a day, and be damned to you," said he, catching Hepburn by the shoulder and giving him a push. Philip stumbled over something in this, his forced run. He looked down. His foot had caught in Kinraid's hat, which had dropped off in the previous struggle. In the band that went round the low crown a ribbon was knotted, a piece of that same ribbon which Philip had chosen out, with such tender hope, to give to Sylvia for the Corneys' party on New Year's Eve. He knew every delicate thread that made up the Bry-Rose pattern, and a spasm of hatred towards Kinraid contracted his heart. He had been almost relenting into pity for the man captured before his eyes. Now he abhorred him. Kinraid did not speak for a minute or two. The sailors, who had begun to take him into favour, were all agog with curiosity to hear the message to his sweetheart which they believed he was going to send. Hepburn's perceptions, quickened with his vehement agitation of soul, were aware of this feeling of theirs, and it increased his rage against Kinraid, who had exposed the idea of Sylvia to be the subject of ribald whispers. But the specksioneer cared little what others said or thought about the maiden, whom he yet saw before his closed eyelids as she stood watching him from the Haytersbank gully, waving her hands, her handkerchief, all in one passionate farewell. "What do you want with me?" asked Hepburn at last in a gloomy tone. If he could have helped it, he would have kept silence till Kinraid spoke first, but he could no longer endure the sailors' nudges and winks and jests among themselves. "Tell Sylvia," said Kinraid. "There's a smart name for his sweetheart," exclaimed one of the men, but Kinraid went straight on. "What you've seen, how I've been pressed by this cursed gang." "Civil words, messmate, if you please. Sylvia can't abide cursing and swearing, I'm sure. We're gentlemen serving his Majesty on board the Alcestis, and this proper young fellow shall be helped on to more honour and glory than he'd ever get bobbing for Wales. Tell Sylvia this with my love. Jack Carter's love, if she's anxious about my name." One of the sailors laughed at this rude humour, another bade Carter hold his stupid tongue. Philip hated him in his heart. Kinraid hardly heard him. He was growing faint with the heavy blows he had received, the stunning fall he had met with, and the reaction from his dogged self-control at first. Philip did not speak nor move. "Tell her," continued Kinraid, rousing himself for another effort, "what you've seen. Tell her I'll come back to her. Bid her not forget the great oath we took together this morning. She's as much my wife as if we'd gone to church. I'll come back and marry her afore long." Philip said something inarticulately. "Hurrah!" cried Carter, "and I'll be best man. Tell her too that I'll have an eye on her sweetheart and keep him from running after other girls." "You'll have your hands full then," muttered Philip, his passion boiling over at the thought of having been chosen out, from among all men, to convey such a message as Kinraid's to Sylvia. "Make an end of your damned yarns and be off," said the man who had been hurt by Kinraid, who had stayed apart and silent till now. Philip turned away. Kinraid raised himself and cried after him, "Hepburn, Hepburn, tell her!" What he added Philip could not hear, for the words were lost before they reached him in the outward noise of the regular splash of the oars and the rush of the wind down the gully, with which mingled the closer sound that filled his ears of his own hurrying blood surging up into his brain. He was conscious that he had said something in reply to Kinraid's adjuration that he would deliver his message to Sylvia, at the very time when Carter had stung him into fresh anger by the allusion to the possibility of the specksioneers running after other girls; for an instant, Hepburn had been touched by the contrast of circumstances. Kinraid an hour or two ago, Kinraid a banished man; for in those days an impressed sailor might linger out years on some foreign station, far from those he loved, who all this time remained ignorant of his cruel fate. But Hepburn began to wonder what he himself had said, how much of a promise he had made to deliver those last passionate words of Kinraid's. He could not recollect how much, how little he had said. He knew he had spoken hoarsely and low, almost at the same time as Carter had uttered his loud joke; but he doubted if Kinraid had caught his words. And then the dread inner creature who lurks in each of our hearts arose and said, "It is as well. A promise given is a fetter to the giver, but a promise is not given when it has not been received." At a sudden impulse he turned again towards the shore when he had crossed the bridge, and almost ran towards the verge of the land. Then he threw himself down on the soft fine turf that grew on the margin of the cliffs overhanging the sea, and commanding an extent of view towards the north. His face supported by his hands, he looked down upon the blue rippling ocean, flashing here and there into the sunlight in long glittering lines. The boat was still in the distance, making her swift silent way with long regular bounds to the tender that lay in the offing. Hepburn felt insecure, as in a nightmare dream, so long as the boat did not reach her immediate destination. His contracted eyes could see 4 minute figures rowing with ceaseless motion, and a 5th sate at the helm. But he knew there was a 6th, unseen, lying bound and helpless at the bottom of the boat, and his fancy kept expecting this man to start up and break his bonds, and overcome all the others, and return to the shore free and triumphant. It was by no fault of Hepburn's that the boat sped well away, that she was now alongside the tender dancing on the waves, now emptied of her crew, now hoisted up to her place. No fault of his. And yet it took him some time before he could reason himself into the belief that his mad, feverish wishes not an hour before, his wild prayer to be rid of his rival, as he himself had scrambled onward over the rocks alongside of Kinraid's path on the sands, had not compelled the event. Anyhow, thought he as he rose up, my prayer is granted. God be thanked. Once more he looked out towards the ship. She had spread her beautiful great sails, and was standing out to sea in the glittering path of the descending sun. He saw that he had been delayed on his road, and had lingered long. He shook his stiffened limbs, shouldered his knapsack, and prepared to walk on to Hartlepool as swiftly as he could. End of chapter 18.
Of Sylvia's Lovers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Elizabeth Klett. Sylvia's Lovers by Elizabeth Gaskell. Chapter 19. An Important Mission. Philip was too late for the coach he had hoped to go by, but there was another that left at night, and which reached Newcastle in the forenoon, so that by the loss of a night's sleep he might overtake his lost time. But restless and miserable, he could not stop in Hartlepool longer than to get some hasty food at the inn from which the coach started. He acquainted himself with the names of the towns through which it would pass, and the inns at which it would stop, and left word that the coachman was to be on the lookout for him, and pick him up at some one of these places. He was thoroughly worn out before this happened, too much tired to gain any sleep in the coach. When he reached Newcastle he went to engage his passage at the next London-bound smack, and then directed his steps to Robinson's, in the side, to make all the inquiries he could think of respecting the plough his uncle wanted to know about. So it was pretty late in the afternoon, indeed almost evening, before he arrived at the small inn on the quayside where he intended to sleep. It was but a rough kind of place, frequented principally by sailors. He had been recommended to it by Daniel Robson, who had known it well in former days. The accommodation in it was, however, clean and homely, and the people keeping it were respectable enough in their way. Still, Hepburn was rather repelled by the appearance of the sailors who sat drinking in the bar, and he asked in a low voice if there was not another room. The woman stared in surprise and only shook her head. Hepburn went to a separate table away from the roaring fire, which on this cold March evening was the great attraction, and called for food and drink. Then, seeing that the other men were eyeing him with the sociable idea of speaking to him, he asked for pen and ink and paper, with the intention of defeating their purpose by preoccupation on his part. But when the paper came, the new pen, the unused thickened ink, he hesitated long before he began to write, and at last he slowly put down the words, "Dear and honoured uncle." There was a pause. His meal was brought and hastily swallowed. Even while he was eating it, he kept occasionally touching up the letters of these words. When he had drunk a glass of ale, he began again to write, fluently this time, for he was giving an account of the plough. Then came another long stop. He was weighing in his own mind what he should say about Kinraid. Once he thought for a second of writing to Sylvia herself and telling her how much. She might treasure up her lover's words like grains of gold, while they were lighter than dust in their meaning to Philip's mind, words which such as the specksioneer used as counters to beguile and lead astray silly women. It was for him to prove his constancy by action, and the chances of his giving such proof were infinitesimal in Philip's estimation. But should the latter mention the bare fact of Kinraid's impressment to Robson? That would have been the natural course of things, remembering that the last time Philip had seen either they were in each other's company. 20 times he put his pen to the paper with the intention of relating briefly the event that had befallen Kinraid, and as often he stopped, as though the first word would be irrevocable. While thus he sat, pen in hand, thinking himself wiser than conscience, and looking on beyond the next step which he bade him take into an indefinite future, he caught some fragments of the sailors' talk at the other end of the room, which made him listen to their words. They were speaking of that very Kinraid, the thought of whom filled his own mind like an actual presence. In a rough, careless way they spoke of the specksioneer, with admiration enough for his powers as a sailor and harpooner, and from that they passed on to jesting mention of his power amongst women, and 1 or 2 girls' names were spoken of in connection with him. Hepburn silently added Annie Coulson and Sylvia Robson to the list, and his cheeks turned paler as he did so. Long after they had done speaking about Kinraid, after they had paid their shot and gone away, he sat in the same attitude, thinking bitter thoughts. The people of the house prepared for bed. Their silent guest took no heed of their mute signs. At length the landlord spoke to him, and he started, gathered his wits together with an effort, and prepared to retire with the rest. But before he did so, he signed and directed the letter to his uncle, leaving it still open, however, in case some sudden feeling should prompt him to add a postscript. The landlord volunteered the information that the letter his guest had been writing must be posted early the next morning if it was going south, as the mails in that direction only left Newcastle every other day. All night long Hepburn wearied himself with passionate tossings, prompted by stinging recollections. Toward morning he fell into a dead sound sleep. He was roused by a hasty knocking at the door. It was broad full daylight. He had overslept himself, and the smack was leaving by the early tide. He was even now summoned on board. He dressed, wafered his letter, and rushed with it to the neighbouring post office, and without caring to touch the breakfast for which he paid, he embarked. Once on board, he experienced the relief which it is always to an undecided man, and generally is at first to any one who has been paltering with duty, when circumstances decide for him. In the first case, it is pleasant to be relieved from the burden of decision. In the second, the responsibility seems to be shifted on to impersonal events. And so Philip sailed out of the mouth of the Tyne onto the great open sea. It would be a week before the smack reached London, even if she pursued a tolerably straight course. But she had to keep a sharp lookout after possible impressment of her crew, and it was not until after many dodges and some adventures that, at the end of a fortnight from the time of his leaving Monkshaven, Philip found himself safely housed in London, and ready to begin the delicate piece of work which was given him to do. He felt himself fully capable of unravelling each clue to information, and deciding on the value of the knowledge so gained. But during the leisure of the voyage he had wisely determined to communicate everything he learnt about Dickinson, in short, every step he took in the matter, by letter to his employers. And thus his mind, both in and out of his lodgings, might have appeared to have been fully occupied with the concerns of others. But there were times when the miserable luxury of dwelling upon his own affairs was his, when he lay down in his bed till he fell into restless sleep, when the point to which his steps tended in his walks was ascertained. Then he gave himself up to memory, and regret which often deepened into despair, but seldom was cheered by hope. He grew so impatient of the ignorance in which he was kept, for in those days of heavy postage any correspondence he might have had on mere Monkshaven intelligence was very limited. As to the affairs at Haytersbank, that he cut out an advertisement respecting some new kind of plough from a newspaper that lay in the chop-house where he usually dined, and rising early the next morning he employed the time thus gained in going round to the shop where these new ploughs were sold. That night he wrote another letter to Daniel Robson, with a long account of the merits of the implements he had that day seen. With a sick heart and a hesitating hand, he wound up with a message of regard to his aunt and to Sylvia, an expression of regard which he dared not make as warm as he wished, and which consequently fell below the usual mark attained by such messages, and would have appeared to anyone who cared to think about it as cold and formal. When this letter was dispatched, Hepburn began to wonder what he had hoped for in writing it. He knew that Daniel could write, or rather that he could make strange hieroglyphics, the meaning of which puzzled others and often himself, but these pen and ink signs were seldom employed by Robson, and never, so far as Philip knew, for the purpose of letter-writing. But still he craved so for news of Sylvia, even for a sight of paper which she had seen and perhaps touched, that he thought all his trouble about the plough, to say nothing of the 1 and 2p. postage which he had prepaid in order to make sure of his letter's reception in the frugal household at Haytersbank, well lost for the mere chance of his uncle's caring enough for the intelligence to write in reply, or even to get some friend to write in answer, for in such case, perhaps, Philip might see her name mentioned in some way, even though it was only that she sent her duty to him. But the post office was dumb. No letter came from Daniel Robson. Philip heard, it is true, from his employers pretty frequently on business, and he felt sure they would have named it if any ill had befallen his uncle's family, for they knew of the relationship and of his intimacy there. They generally ended their formal letters with as formal a summary of the Monkshaven news, but there was never a mention of the Robsons, and that of itself was well, but it did not soothe Philip's impatient curiosity. He had never confided his attachment to his cousin to any one, it was not his way, but he sometimes thought that if Coulson had not taken his present appointment to a confidential piece of employment so ill, he could have written to him and asked him to go up to Haytersbank Farm, and let him know how they all were. All this time he was transacting the affair on which he had been sent with great skill, and indeed in several ways he was quietly laying the foundation for enlarging the business in Monkshaven. Naturally grave and quiet, and slow to speak, he impressed those who saw him with the idea of greater age and experience than he really possessed. Indeed, those who encountered him in London thought he was absorbed in the business of money-making. Yet before the time came when he could wind up affairs and return to Monkshaven, he would have given all he possessed for a letter from his uncle, telling him something about Sylvia. For he still hoped to hear from Robson, although he knew that he hoped against reason. But we often convince ourselves by good argument that what we wish for need never have been expected, and then, at the end of our reasoning, find that we might have saved ourselves the trouble, for that our wishes are untouched, and are as strong enemies to our peace of mind as ever. Hepburn's balked hope was the Mordecai sitting in Haman's gate. All his success in his errand to London, his well-doing in worldly affairs, was tasteless, and gave him no pleasure, because of this blank and void of all intelligence concerning Sylvia. And yet he came back with a letter from the Fosters in his pocket, curt, yet expressive of deep gratitude for his discreet services in London, and at another time, in fact, if Philip's life had been ordered differently to what it was, it might have given this man a not unworthy pleasure to remember that, without a penny of his own, simply by diligence, honesty, and faithful quick-sightedness as to the interest of his masters, he had risen to hold the promise of being their successor, and to be ranked by them as a trusted friend. As the Newcastle smack neared the shore on her voyage home, Hepburn looked wistfully out for the faint grey outline of Monkshaven Priory against the sky, and the well-known cliffs, as if the masses of inanimate stone could tell him any news of Sylvia. In the streets of Shields just after landing, he encountered a neighbour of the Robsons and an acquaintance of his own. By this honest man he was welcomed as a great traveller is welcomed on his return from a long voyage, with many hearty good shakes of the hand, much repetition of kind wishes, and offers to treat him to drink. Yet, from some insurmountable feeling, Philip avoided all mention of the family who were the principal bond between the honest farmer and himself. He did not know why, but he could not bear the shock of first hearing her name in the open street, or in the rough public house, and thus he shrank from the intelligence he craved to hear. Thus he knew no more about the Robsons when he returned to Monkshaven than he had done on the day when he had last seen them, and of course his first task there was to give a long viva voce account of all his London proceedings to the two brothers Foster, who, considering that they had heard the result of everything by letter, seemed to take an insatiable interest in details. He could hardly tell why, but even when released from the Fosters' parlour, he was unwilling to go to Haytersbank Farm. It was late, it is true, but on a May evening even country people keep up till 8 or 9 o'clock. Perhaps it was because Hepburn was still in his travel-stained dress, having gone straight to the shop on his arrival in Monkshaven. Perhaps it was because, if he went this night for the short half-hour intervening before bedtime, he would have no excuse for paying a longer visit on the following evening. At any rate, he proceeded straight to Alice Rose's as soon as he had finished his interview with his employers. Both Hester and Coulson had given him their welcome home in the shop, which they had, however, left an hour or two before him. Yet they gave him a fresh greeting, almost one in which surprise was blended, when he came to his lodgings. Even Alice seemed gratified by his spending this first evening with them, as if she had thought it might have been otherwise. Weary though he was, he exerted himself to talk and to relate what he had done and seen in London, as far as he could without breaking confidence with his employers. It was something to see the pleasure he gave to his auditors, although there were several mixed feelings in their minds to produce the expression of which it gratified him. Coulson was sorry for his former ungenerous reception of the news that Philip was going to London. Hester and her mother each secretly began to feel as if this evening was like more happy evenings of old, before the Robsons came to Haytersbank Farm, and who knows what faint delicious hopes this resemblance may not have suggested. While Philip, restless and excited, feeling that he could not sleep, was glad to pass away the waking hours that must intervene before to-morrow night, at times he tried to make them talk of what had happened in Monkshaven during his absence. But all had gone on in an eventless manner as far as he could gather. If they knew of anything affecting the Robsons, they avoided speaking of it to him, and indeed, how little likely were they ever to have heard their names while he was away. Chapter 20